Chapter 4. On the evening of the second day, the men went down to the lake. The rain had held off that day, but it had been cold, with a high wind and much cloud. Kolbein rode with 5 of his men. Steinfinn had with him 7 housecarls and Olav Audunsson. Arnvid followed with 1 henchman. Kolbein had provided boats, which lay concealed in a cove of Lake Mjøsa, a little to the northward. Ingunn went early to rest in her loft. She did not know how long she had slept when she was awakened by a touch on her chest. "Is it you?" she whispered, heavy with sleep, expecting only to find Olaf's soft locks. But she awoke to see a coiffed head. "Mother?" she cried in astonishment. "I can get no sleep," said Ingeborg. "I have been walking outside. Put on some clothes and come down." Ingunn got up obediently and dressed. She was surprised beyond measure. It was not so late after all, she saw on coming out. The weather had cleared. The moon, nearly full, rose due south above the ridge, pale red like a sunset cloud, giving no light as yet. The mother's hand was as hot as fire as she took her daughter's. Ingeborg drew the girl along, roving hither and thither beyond the houses, but saying scarcely a word. At one moment they stayed leaning over the fence of a cornfield. Down in the field was a waterhole surrounded by tall, thick rushes, which were darkly mirrored in it, but in the middle of the small little pond the moon shone. It had now risen high enough to give a yellow light. The mother looked into the distance, where the lake and the farms surrounding it lay in a pale, calm mist. "Have you the wit to see, I wonder, what we have all at stake?" said Ingeborg. Ingunn felt her cheeks go white and cold at her mother's words. She had always known what there was to know of her father and mother. She had known, too, that great events were now at hand. But here, by her mother's side, seeing how she was stirred to the depths of her soul, she guessed for the first time what it all meant. A feeble sound came from her lips, like the squeaking of a mouse. Ingeborg's ravaged face was drawn sideways in a sort of smile. "Are you afraid to watch this night with your mother? Tora would not have refused to stay with me, but she is such a child, gentle and quiet. That you are not, and you are the elder, I think," she concluded hotly. Ingunn clasped her slender hands together. Again it was as though she had climbed a little higher, had gained a wider view over her world. She had always been clear that her parents were not very old folk, but now she saw that they were young. Their love, of which she had heard as a tale of old days, was ready to be quickened and to burn with a bright flame, as the fire may be revived from the glowing embers beneath the ashes. With wonder and reluctance, she suspected that her father and mother loved one another even yet, as she and Olaf loved, only so much the more strongly as the river is greater and fuller near its mouth than it was higher up in the hills. And although what she guessed made her ashamed, she felt proud withal at the uncommon lot of her parents. Timidly she held out both hands. "I will gladly watch with you all night, mother." Ingeborg squeezed her daughter's hand. "God can grant Steinfinn no less than that we may wash the shame from us," she said impetuously, clasping the girl and kissing her. Ingunn put her arms around her mother's neck. It was so long since she had kissed her. She remembered it as part of the life that was brought to an end on the night Matthias came to the house. Not that Ingunn had felt the want of it. As a child, she had not been fond of caresses. Between her and Olav it was like something they had found out for themselves. It had come as the spring comes. One day it is there, like a miracle, but no sooner is it come than one feels it must be summer always, like the bare strip of sod that borders the cornfield. So long as it lies naked with its withered grass after the thaw, it is nothing but a little grey bulk among the sown. But then there comes a forest of tangled wild growth that makes it well nigh impassable. Now the spring-like bareness of her child's mind was overgrown with a summer luxuriance. She laid her cool, soft cheek against her mother's wasted face. "I will gladly share your watching, mother." The words seemed to sink into herself, for she had to watch for Olav. It was as though her thoughts had been astray when he set out with the others in the evening. She had not thought of the dangers the men were to face. A fear thrilled through her, but it was only as a flutter at the root of her heart. She could not fancy in earnest that anything could happen to one of hers. For all that, she asked, "Mother, are you afraid?" Ingeborg Jonsdatter shook her head. "No, God will give us our right, for right is on our side." When she saw her daughter's look, she added, with a smile Ingunn did not like, there was a queer cunning in it. "You see, my girl, it is on this wise. It is a lucky chance that King Magnus died this spring. We have kinsmen and friends among those who will now have most power. So says Kolbein. And there are many of them who would like to see Matthias. Do you know what manner of man he is? Oh, no, you cannot. He is short, is Matthias. Yet there are many who think he might be shorter by a head. Queen Ingeborg never liked him. You must know, but for that he would not lie buried at this time, when knights and barons are gathering at Bjorgvin, and the young king is to be crowned." She went on talking as they walked along the fences. Ingunn fervently desired to speak to her mother of Olav Audunsson, but she guessed she was so wholly lost in her own thoughts that she would not care to hear of anything else. Yet she could not help saying, "Was it not an ill chance that Olav could not fetch his axe in time?" "Oh, your father will have seen that they are as well armed as there is need, with all the men he has taken with him," said the mistress. "Steinfinn would not have had the boy with him, but he begged leave to go." "But you are cold," said her mother a moment later. "Put on your cloak." Ingunn's cloak still hung in her mother's room. She had not fetched it in all these 14 days, but had worn Olaf's fine mantle when she needed an outer garment. Her mother went in with her. She stirred the fire on the hearth and lighted the lantern. "Your father and I will want to move into the great loft in summer. Had we been sleeping there the night Matthias came, he could not have taken Steinfinn unawares. It will be safer for us to sleep there till Steinfinn be made free of the law." The great loft room had no outside stairway, for it had been used for storing household goods of value. From the floor below, a ladder led up into the loft. It was not often that Ingunn had been up there. The very smell of the place gave her a solemn feeling. Bags of strong-smelling spices hung among bed-covers of fur and leather sacks. There was almost an uncanny look about all the things that hung from the roof. Against the walls stood great chests. Ingunn went up to Olaf's and let the light fall on it. It was of pale limewood and carved. Ingeborg opened the door to the balcony. She emptied the bedstead of all that was piled upon it and began searching in chests and coffers, making her daughter hold the light for her. Then she dropped on the floor all she had in her hands and went out on the balcony. The moon was now so far to the westward that its light lay like a golden bridge over the water. It was about to sink into a bank of heavy blue clouds, some shreds of which floated up toward the moon and were gilded. The mother went in again and turned over more of the chests. She had come upon a woman's gown of silk, green with a woven pattern of yellow flowers. The light of the lantern gave the whole kirtle the tint of a fading aspen.
"This I will give to you now."
Ingunn curtsied and kissed her mother's hand. A silken gown she had never owned before. From a little casket of walrus ivory her mother took a green velvet ribbon set all over with silver gilt roses. She put it over the crown of her daughter's head, pushed it a little forward, and brought the ends together at the back of the neck under the hair.
"So, fair as you looked to be when you were small, you are not. But you have grown fairer again this summer. It is time for you to wear the garland. You are a marriageable maid now, my Ingunn." "Yes, Olaf and I have spoken of that too,"
Ingunn took courage to say. She strove instinctively to speak as naturally as she could. Ingeborg looked up. They were both crouching before a chest.
"Have Olaf and you spoken of that?"
"Yes." Ingunn spoke as calmly as before, dropping her eyelids meekly.
"We are old enough now to expect that you will soon see to the fulfilment of this bargain that was made for us." "Oh, that bargain was not of a kind that cannot be undone again," said her mother. "If you yourselves have no mind to it, we shall not force you." "No, we are well pleased with what you have purposed for us," said Ingunn meekly. "We are agreed that it is well as our fathers have disposed." "So that is the way of it."
Ingeborg stared thoughtfully before her.
"Then I doubt not some means will be found. Do you like Olaf well?" she asked. "What could I do else? We have known each other so long, and he has always been good and kind, and had shown himself dutiful towards you."
Her mother nodded thoughtfully.
"We didn't know, Steinfinn and I, whether you two remembered anything of that bargain, or thought more of it. Yes, some means must be found one way or another. At your age, you two cannot be so closely tied. He is handsome, Olaf, and Audun left wealth behind him."
Ingunn would fain have said more of Olaf, but she saw that her mother was far away in her own thoughts again.
"We went by desert paths, your father and I, when we crossed the fells," she said. "From Vors we took to the moors, and then we passed through the upper dales. There was still much snow on the fells. In one place we had to stay a whole week in a stone hut. It stood beside a tarn, and a snowfield came down into the water. We heard the flakes of ice break off and splash into the lake as we lay at night. Steinfinn offered a gold ring from his finger at the first church we came to below. It was a holy day. The poor folk of the fells stared at us. We had ridden from the town as we stood in our Sunday clothes. They were much the worse for wear, but for all that, no such clothes had ever been seen in that dale. But I was a weary bride when Steinfinn brought me home to Hove, and already I bore you under my heart."
Ingunn stared at her mother as though spellbound. In the faint light of the lantern which stood on the floor between them, she saw so strange a smile on her mother's face. Ingeborg stroked her daughter's head and drew her long plaits through her hand.
"And now you are already a grown maid."
Her mother rose and gave her the great embroidered bed-cover, bidding her shake it out over the balcony. "Mother!" the girl cried loudly from outside. Ingeborg ran out to her. It was almost daylight, and the sky was pale and clear high up, but clouds and mist lay over the land. Straight across the lake in the northwest, a great fire was blazing, shedding a ruddy light on the thick air far around. Black smoke poured out, drifted away and mingled with the fog, thickening and darkening it far over the ridge. Now and again they saw the very flames when they rose high, but the burning homestead lay hidden behind a tongue of the woods. The two women stood for a while gazing at it. The mother said nothing, and the girl dared not speak. Then the mistress turned into the loft. A moment later Ingunn saw her running across the yard to her little house. Two women servants rushed out in their bare shifts and ran down to the courtyard fence. Then came Tora with her fair hair fluttering loose, her mother leading her two young sons and all the women of the place. Their cries and talk reached Ingunn. But when they began to swarm up into the loft, she stole out. With her head bent and her hands crossed under the cloak which she held tight about her, she would have wished to be quite invisible. She crept up to her own loft and lay down. A violent fit of weeping came upon her. She could not make out what it was she wept for. It was just that she was too full of all that had crowded in upon her that night. She could not bear others to come near her. It made her tears run over. And she was very tired. It was morning now. When she awoke, the sun was shining in at the door. Ingunn started up and pulled on her shift. She heard there were horses in the yard. 4 or 5 of their own strayed about, grazing, unsaddled. Olav's dun elk was among them. And there was a neighing from the paddock. The maids ran between the cookhouse and the hall. They were all in festival clothes. She threw her cloak over her and ran to the eastern bower. The floor was strewed with briar roses and meadowsweet. It almost took her breath away. She had not seen festivity in her home since she was a little girl. Drinking bouts in the hall and banquets on high days, but not such as they strewed the rooms with flowers for. Her silken kirtle and the gilt circlet lay on Olaf's carved wooden box. Ingunn fetched them and ran back. She had no mirror, but she did not feel the want of it as she stood ready dressed in her bower. She felt the weight of the gilt garland over her flowing hair, looked down at her figure wrapped in the green and yellow silk. The kirtle fell in long folds from her bosom to her feet, held in slightly by the silver belt at her waist. The gown was ample and long, so she had to lift it with both hands as she stepped over the grass of the courtyard. Full of delight, she knew that she looked like one of the carven images in a church, tall and slender, low-bosomed and slight of limb, gleaming with jewels. At the door of the hall she stopped, overwhelmed. The long fires were burning on the central hearth, and the sunshine poured in through the smoke vent, turning the smoke sky blue as it drifted under the rafters. And lighted torches stood on the board before the high seat facing the door. There sat her mother by her father's side, and her mother was dressed in red silk. Instead of the kerchief which Ingunn was used to seeing on her, she wore a starched white coif. It rose like a crown above her forehead and left the back of her head uncovered. Her knot of hair gleamed golden within a net. The other women were not seated at table. They went to and fro, bearing meat and drink. Ingunn then took up a tankard. She carried it in her right hand and held up her gown with her left, making herself as lithe and supple as she could. She thrust her hips well forward, dropped her shoulders to make herself look more narrow-breasted, and bowed her neck, leaning her head to one side like a flower on its stalk. Thus she moved forward, gliding as lightly as she could. But the men were already half drunken, and maybe too tired after the night's exploit. None paid any great heed to her. Her father looked up with a laugh when she filled his beaker. His eyes were bright and stiff, his face blazed red under its tousled, tawny hair, and now Ingunn saw that one arm was bound up over his chest. He had on his best cloak over the tight leather jerkin which he wore under the coat of mail. Most of the men seemed to have sat down to the table just as they came from the saddle. Her father signed to her to pour out for Kolbein and his two sons, Einar and Haftor. They sat at Steinfinn's right hand. On Steinfinn's left sat Arnvid. He was red in the face, and his dark blue eyes shone like metal. A tremor passed over his features as he stared at his young kinswoman. Ingunn could see that he, at any rate, thought her fair this evening, and she smiled with joy as she filled his cup. She came where Olav Audunsson sat on the outer bench, and squeezed in between him and his neighbour as she poured out for those sitting on the inner bench. Then the boy caught hold of her down by the knees and pressed her toward him, screened by the table, making her spill the drink. Ingunn saw at once that he was drunk. He sat astride the bench with his legs stretched far out, his head supported in one hand, with the elbow on the table among the food. It was so unlike Olav to sit thus that she could not help laughing. They used always to tease him for keeping just as steady and quiet, no matter what he drank. God's gifts did not bite on him, said the others. But this evening the ale had plainly got the better even of his stiffness. When she was going to pour out for him, he seized her hands, put the tankard to his lips, and drank, spilling the drink over himself, so that the breast of his elk-skin jerkin was all befouled. "Now, take a drink yourself," he said, laughing up in her face. But his eyes looked so queer and strange. They gleamed with a wanton wildness. Ingunn was flustered a little, but she filled his beaker and drank. Then he clutched her again under the table and came near to making her fall into his arms. The man by Olaf's side took the tankard from them. "Bide a while, you two. You must leave a drop for the rest of us." Ingunn went out to fill the tankard again, and then she saw that her hands trembled. With surprise she found that she was shaking all over. It was almost as if she had been scared by the boy's violence. But she was drawn toward him in a way she had never known before, a sweet and consuming curiosity. She had never seen Olaf in this state. But it was so joyous. This evening nothing was as it was wont to be. As she went about filling the cups, she could not help trying to brush past Olaf, that he might have a chance of stealing those rough and furtive caresses of his. It was as though they drew her on. No one had marked that it was growing dark outside before the rain spurted through the smoke vent. They had to close the ventil. Then Ingeborg bade them bring in more lights. The men rose from the board. Some went to their places to sleep, but others sat down again to drink and talk to the women, who now began to think of food. Arnvid and Einar Kolbeinsson, her cousin, sat down by Ingunn, and Einar was to tell her more of the raid. They had sailed under the eastern shore right up to the river, and there they went across to Vingerheim, so that they came riding down on Matthias's manor from the north. This proved unnecessary, however, as Matthias had set no watch. "He never believed Steinfinn would strike in earnest," said Einar scornfully. "No one can wonder at that. After so much prating and waiting, he would be apt to think that, could Steinfinn bear his shame in patience for 6 years, the 7th would not be too great a burden for him." "Meseems I heard a tale of Matthias, that he fled the country for fear of Steinfinn," said Olav Audunsson, who had joined them. He squeezed in between Arnvid and Ingunn. "Ah, yes, and Steinfinn is lazy too. He's one to sit under the bush and wait till the birds fall into his hand. You would have him take to lawsuits and wrangling like your father?" Arnvid interposed and made them keep the peace. Then Einar took up his story. They came into the courtyard unopposed, and some men were posted to guard those houses in which folk might be sleeping, while Steinfinn and the sons of Kolbein went with Arnvid, Olaf, and 5 of the housecarls to the hall. Kolbein stayed outside. The men within started up from sleep when the door was broken down, some naked and some in their shirts, but all reached for their weapons. There were Matthias and a friend of his, the tenant of the farm, and his half-grown son, and 2 serving men. There came a short struggle, but the drowsy housefolk were quickly overpowered. And then it was Steinfinn and Matthias. "This was unlooked for. Are you abroad thus betimes, Steinfinn?" said Matthias. "I remember that you were once so sound a sleeper, and a fair wife you had to keep you to your bed." "Ay, and it was she who sent me hither with her greeting," said Steinfinn. "You surely won her heart when last you came to us. She cannot put you out of her mind. But put on your clothes," he said. "I have ever thought it was a dastard's deed to set on a naked man." Matthias turned flaming red at those words. But he made light of it and asked, "Will you give me leave to buckle on my coat of mail too, since it seems you would make a show of chivalry?" "No," cried Steinfinn, "for I have no thought that you shall come off with your life from this our meeting. But I am nothing loath to meet you unharnessed." While Steinfinn unbuckled his coat of mail, Kolbein came in, and he and another man held Matthias. This he liked ill, but Steinfinn said with a laugh, "I think you are more ticklish than I was. You cannot bear a man's hand near your skin." After that, Steinfinn let Matthias put on his clothes and take a shield. Then the 2 set upon each other. In his youth, Steinfinn had been counted most skilful in the use of arms, but of late he had fallen out of practice. It was quickly seen that Matthias, small and slight as he was, would be more than a match for the other. Steinfinn had to give ground, foot by foot. His breath came heavily. Then Matthias made a cut at him and disabled his right arm. Steinfinn changed his sword over to his left hand. Both men had long since thrown away the wreckage of their shields. But now Steinfinn's men thought it looked badly for their master. On a sign from Kolbein, one of his men sprang to Steinfinn's side. Matthias was somewhat dazed at this, and now Steinfinn gave him his death blow. "But they fought like 2 good lads, we all said that," said Arnvid. Meanwhile, as ill luck would have it, some of the strange men-at-arms whom Steinfinn had had with him bethought them of pillage, and others tried to prevent it. And in the tumult some man set fire to a stack of birch bark which stood in the narrow gangway between the hall and one of the storehouses. It was doubtless that Jostolv was the man who did it, a man no one thought well of, and he must have carried bark into the storehouse too, for it burst into flames on the instant, though timbers and roof were wet from the rain. And then the fire took hold of the hall. they had to bear out Matthias's corpse and loose the other men. Now folk came up from the neighbouring farms, and a number of these peasants came to blows with them. Some were hurt on both sides, but it was unlikely that more were slain. "Aye, we need not have had the fire and the brawling on our hands," said Einar, had not Steinfinn been set on showing prowess and chivalry. Olaf had never liked Einar Kolbeinsson. He was 3 years older than himself, and had always loved to tease the younger boys with his spite. So Olaf answered him pretty scornfully. No man will charge your father or your brothers with that. No one will accuse Kolbein Bjorkildsen of goading on his half-brother to ill-timed high-mindedness. Have a care of yourself, young sniveller. Father's name has always stood next to Tor of Hove. Our stock is just as good as Asa's offspring. Remember that, Olaf, and don't sit there fondling my kinswoman. Take your paw out of her lap and quick about it." Olaf jumped up, and they were at each other. Ingunn and Arnvid ran to separate them. Then it was that Steinfinn rose and called for silence. The housefolk, men and women, and the strangers drew toward the table. Steinfinn stood leaning on his wife's shoulder. He was no longer red in the face, but white and sunken under the eyes. But he smiled and held himself erect as he spoke. "Now I will give you thanks, all you who were with me in this deed. First, I will thank you, brother, and your sons, and then my dear cousin, Arnvid Finnsson, and you others, good kinsmen and trusty men. If God will, we shall soon have peace and atonement for these things that have befallen this night. For he is a righteous God, and it is his will that a man shall hold his wife in honour and protect the good name of women. But I am weary now, good friends, and now we will go to bed, I and my wife. And you must forgive me that I say no more, but I am weary, and I have gotten a small scratch too. But Grim and Dalla will have good care of you, and now you may drink as long as you want, and play and be merry as is fitting on a joyful day such as this. But now we go to rest, Ingeborg and I, and so you must forgive us that we leave you now." Towards the close, his speech had become thick and halting. He swayed slightly on his feet, and Ingeborg had to support him as they went out of the hall. Some of the housecarls had raised a cheer, hammering on the tables with their knives and drinking cups. But the noise died away of itself, and the men stood aside in silence. Not a few of them guessed that Steinfinn's wound might be worse than he would have it thought. All followed them out, stood in silent groups, watching the tall and handsome couple as they went together to the loft room in the rain-drenched summer evening. Most of them marked how Steinfinn stood still and seemed to speak hastily to his wife. It looked as though she opposed him and tried to hold his hand, but he tore off the bandage which bound his wounded arm to his breast and flung it impatiently from him. They heard Steinfinn laugh as he went on. The housefolk were still quiet when they came in again, though Grim and Dalla had more drink brought in and fresh wood thrown on the fire. The table and benches were cleared out of the way, but most of the men were tired and seemed most inclined for sleep. Yet some went out into the yard to dance, but came in again at once. The shower was just overhead, and the grass was too wet. Ingunn still sat between Arnvid and Olaf had laid his hand in her lap. "Silk," he said, stroking her knee. "Silk is fine." He went on saying this again and again. "You are bemused and don't know what you say," said Arnvid with vexation. "You're half asleep already. Go to bed." But Olaf shook his head and laughed softly to himself. "I'll go when I please." Meanwhile, some of the men had taken up their swords and stood up for dancing. Hafthor Kolbeinsson came up to Arnvid and would have him sing for them. But Arnvid declined. He was too tired, he said. Nor would Olaf and Ingunn take part in the dance. They said they did not know that particular song. Einar headed the chain of dancers with his drawn sword in his right hand. Tora held his left and had placed her other hand on the next man's shoulder. Thus they stood in a row, a man with a drawn sword and then a woman, all down the hall. It was a fine sight, with all the blades held high. The chain moved 3 paces to the right. Then the men stepped to the left, while the women had to take 1 pace to the rear, so that the men stood in line before them. And then they crossed swords in pairs and marked time with their feet, as the women ran under the weapons and reformed the chain. There was no one among the dancers who was quite sure of the steps. When the women were to leap forward under the swords, they made a poor shift to keep time with the men's tramping. The place was too narrow and constrained between the long hearth and the row of posts that held up the roof and divided the sleeping places from the hall. The 3 on the dais at the end had risen to have a better view. And when the game threatened to break up even in the second verse, people shouted again for Arnvid and bade him come in. They knew that he could sing the whole dance, and he had the finest of voices. So when he took his sword, drew it, and placed himself at the head of the row of dancers, the game at once took better shape. Olaf and Ingunn stepped in just below him. Arnvid led as surely and gracefully as anyone could look for who saw his high-shouldered, stooping figure. He took up the song in his full, clear voice, while the women swayed in and out under the play of swords. Then all was confusion, for there was no woman between Olaf and Einar. The dancers had to stop, and Einar declared that Olaf must stand out. They quarrelled over this until one of the older housecarls said he would much rather go out. Then Arnvid set the game going again. But all the time the ranks were in confusion, and as they came farther on in the song, there was no one but Arnvid who knew the words. Some of them had a scrap of one verse, some of another. Olaf and Einar were bickering the whole time, and there were all too few who sang the tune. Arnvid was tired, and he had got some scratches which began to smart, he said, as soon as he stirred himself. So the chain broke up. Some went and threw themselves on their sleeping benches. Some stood chatting and would have had more to drink, or they still wished to dance, but to one of these new ballads, the steps of which were much easier. Olaf stood in the shadow under the roof posts. He and Ingunn still held each other's hands. Olaf thrust his sword into the scabbard. "Come, we will go up to your loft and talk together," he whispered. Hand in hand they ran through the rain over the dark and empty yard, dashed up the stair, and stopped inside the door, panting with excitement, as though they had done something unlawful. Then they flung their arms about one another. Ingunn bent the boy's head against her bosom and sniffed at his hair. "There is a smell of burning on you," she murmured. "Oh no, oh no," she begged in fear. He was pressing her against the doorpost. "No, no, I am going now," he whispered. "I am going now," he kept repeating. "Yes." But she clung to him closely, dazed and quivering, afraid he would do as he said and go. She knew they had lost their senses, both of them, but all thoughts of past and present seemed swept away on the stream of the last wild, ungoverned hours, and they too had been flung ashore in this dark loft. Why should they leave each other? They only had each other. She felt her gilt circlet pushed up on her crown. Olaf was rumpling her loosened hair. The garland fell off, jingling on the floor, and the lad took fistfuls of her hair and pressed them to his face, buried his chin in her shoulder. Then they heard Reidun, the serving maid who slept with Ingunn, calling to someone from the yard below. They started apart, trembling with guilty conscience. And quick as lightning, Olaf shot out his arm, pulled the door to, and bolted it. Reidun came up into the balcony, knocked, and called to Ingunn. The two children stood in pitch darkness, shaken by the beating of their hearts. The maid knocked a while, thundered on the door. Then she must have thought Ingunn had fallen asleep, and soundly. They heard the stairs creak under her heavy tread. Out in the yard she called to another maid. They guessed she had gone off to sleep in another house. And Olaf and Ingunn flew to each other's arms, as though they had escaped a great danger.